By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
The rain in Lochdubh did not fall so much as it hovered, a fine grey saturation that turned the surrounding hills into ghostly humps and the waters of the sea loch into a sheet of hammered lead. It was the kind of weather that encouraged a man of sense to stay indoors by a peat fire with a pot of strong coffee and a thick book. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth considered himself a man of supreme sense. He sat on a damp rock overlooking the black water, his lanky frame draped in a tattered waterproof that had seen better decades. Beside him, his dog Lugs, a creature of uncertain pedigree and even more uncertain temperament, let out a low, mournful sigh. Between them lay a shimmering silver Atlantic salmon, recently and quite illegally liberated from the river. Hamish checked his battered watch. It was 11:30. If he timed it right, he could get the fish back to his kitchen, hide the evidence, and be seen patrolling the village green just as the pub opened for lunch. This was the delicate balance of Hamish's life, appearing just busy enough to satisfy the distant, angry bureaucrats in Strathbane, but not so efficient that they would ever dream of promoting him. To Hamish, a promotion was a death sentence, a one-way ticket to a concrete office block, traffic fumes, and the constant, shrill supervision of DCI Blair. "Just one more minute, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his voice a soft Highland lilt. "We'll just wait for the mist to swallow the bridge." But the mist did not swallow the bridge. Instead, it parted to reveal a gleaming, oversized silver Range Rover that looked entirely too clean for the Sutherland mud. It bounced aggressively over the potholes, its engine roaring with the impatient entitlement of the very wealthy. The vehicle screeched to a halt near the track. Out stepped a man who looked like he had been curated by an expensive London sporting boutique. He wore brand new tweed that was far too green, yellow leather gloves, and a hat with a feather so long it threatened to take out an eye. "You there!" the man shouted, his voice carrying that sharp nasal English clip that always made the locals of Lochdubh suddenly forget how to speak English. Hamish stood up slowly, subtly kicking a clump of heather over the poached salmon. He put on his most vacant, helpful expression, the look of a man whose brain moved at the approximate speed of a glacier. "Aye, sir?" Hamish called back, his eyes narrowed and innocent. "I am Crispin Westlake," the man announced, marching over. He didn't offer a hand, he offered a complaint. "I bought the old Macrae estate last month. I was told this was a private beat, and yet I've seen 3 different locals wandering about with fishing rods this morning. Is there no law in this god-forsaken wilderness?" Hamish looked at Crispin's polished boots, and then at the grey, indifferent sky. "The law, sir, is a very heavy thing to carry up these hills. Most folk find it easier to leave it at the bottom." Westlake's face turned a shade of puce that matched his silk cravat. "I don't pay exorbitant council taxes to have my property overrun by poachers and layabouts. I expect service. I expect order. You're the village copper, aren't you? You look like you've been sitting here for hours." "I was just observing the water levels, sir," Hamish said mildly. "Very important, the water levels. If they rise too fast, the sheep get ideas about swimming, and they're no very good at it." "Typical," Westlake sneered, looking Hamish up and down with open contempt. "Utterly provincial. I'm warning you, Constable. I'm planning to turn the estate into an elite Highland Wellness Retreat. I won't have the aesthetic ruined by unwashed locals and whatever that animal is." He gestured vaguely at Lugs, who bared a single yellow tooth in response. "The folk here take a bit of getting used to, Mr. Westlake," Hamish said, his tone deceptively soft. "They're like the weather. If you try to push it, it just rains harder on you." "I don't care for riddles," Westlake snapped. "I'm hosting a dinner tonight for some potential investors. If I see one more local on my land, I'll be calling your chief inspector directly. I believe his name is Blair. We shared a very productive, Scotch at the Rotary Club last week. Hamish's heart sank. A friend of Blair's. That was the worst kind of Sassenach, the kind with a direct line to the man who spent his every waking hour trying to find a reason to fire Hamish. Westlake turned on his heel, his expensive boots slipping slightly in the muck, and marched back to his shiny car. As the Range Rover roared away, splashing mud onto Hamish's trousers, the silence of the Highlands rushed back in, but it felt different now, brittle. Hamish looked down at the hidden salmon. He felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck, the same sensation he got before a particularly nasty storm. "He's a rude man, Lugs," Hamish sighed, uncovering the fish. And in a village like Lochdubh, being rude is often more dangerous than being a criminal. "I wonder who's going to kill him first." Lugs let out a short, sharp bark. "Aye," Hamish agreed, picking up the salmon. "But let's hope they wait until after I've had my lunch." The salmon, poached with a illicit sprig of wild herbs and a pat of butter stolen from the hotel's morning delivery, had been sublime. Hamish sat in the small, cramped kitchen of the police station, the air thick with the comforting scent of wood smoke and fried fish. Lugg sat at his feet, his eyes tracking every movement of Hamish's fork with a desperation that bordered on the theatrical. Outside, the Highland wind had picked up, rattling the window pane and singing a lonely, mournful tune through the eaves. Hamish had just poured himself a second cup of coffee, thick, black and strong enough to jump-start a dead tractor, when the peace of Lochdubh was not just broken, but shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The heavy oak door of the station was nearly kicked off its hinges. Archie Macrae, the village's most prolific poacher, and a man whose relationship with the truth was, at best, nodding acquaintanceship, stood in the doorway. He was drenched, his ancient flat cap drooping over one eye like a dying mushroom, and his face was a shade of grey that suggested he'd either seen a ghost or a tax inspector. "Hamish, man, ye have to come. It's the Sassenach, the one with the shiny car and the loud mouth." Archie gasped, clutching the doorframe. Hamish sighed, the steam from his coffee mocking him. "If Mr. Westlake has caught you on his land again, Archie, you'll just have to apologise. I told you he's a man with a short fuse and a long memory for grudges." No, you don't understand," Archie wailed, his voice cracking. "He's no shouting now. He's up on the moor near the standing stones. He's looking very peculiar, Hamish. Very peculiar indeed." With a heavy heart and a final longing look at his warm stove, Hamish stood up. He grabbed his peaked cap, which sat at a rakish, slightly untidy angle on his shocks of red hair, and whistled for Lugs. The walk up toward the moor was a slog through knee-deep heather, and sucking mud that seemed determined to keep Hamish's boots for itself. The rain had turned into a cold, biting sleet that stung the skin. The kind of Highland refreshment that Westlake had probably planned to charge his wellness guests £50 an hour to experience. As they reached the plateau where the ancient standing stones watched over the loch like silent grey sentinels, Hamish saw it. Even from 50 yards away, Crispin Westlake looked out of place. He wasn't just dead, he was an affront to the landscape. The wealthy Englishman was slumped against the tallest of the stones, his body positioned in a way that suggested a grotesque parody of a lounge chair. But it was his attire that brought the undercurrent of dark humour to the surface. Westlake was dressed in what appeared to be a high-tech neon-orange thermal meditation suit, complete with a battery pack and several dangling wires that hissed faintly as the sleet hit them. On his head, tilted at a jaunty, mocking angle, was a pair of silver electronic goggles designed to simulate a tropical sunset. "He looks like a spaceman that's crashed into the Neolithic," Archie whispered, crossing himself. Hamish didn't answer. He approached the body with a slow, deceptively lazy gait, his eyes hooded but missing nothing. He noted the way the heather was trampled, not by a struggle, but by a single set of heavy, frantic footprints leading away toward the estate. He saw the faint, bluish tint around Westlake's lips, partially obscured by the ridiculous goggles. Most importantly, he noticed the small, empty thermos flask lying just inches from the man's gloved hand. It was an expensive, brushed steel thing, the sort of item Westlake would have carried to prove he was prepared for the elements. Luggs sniffed at the air, let out a low whine, and retreated behind Hamish's legs. The dog had a better nose for the unnatural than most humans. Is he gone, Hamish?" Archie asked, hovering 10 feet back. "Aye, Archie, he's gone, and he's taken his elite wellness with him," Hamish said softly. He crouched down, his knees creaking. He didn't touch the body. He knew better than to disturb the scene before the vultures arrived, but he leaned in close. There was a faint, sweet smell clinging to the air around Westlake's mouth, something that didn't belong on a cold Highland moor. It smelled of almonds and expensive honey. Hamish looked back toward the village, where the lights of the Lochdubh Hotel were just beginning to flicker on in the gathering gloom. Somewhere down there, someone was probably feeling a great deal lighter, but for Hamish, the weight had just doubled. Within the hour, the quiet roads would be choked with police cars from Strathbane, and the air would be filled with the screaming rants of DCI Blair. "Ruined," Hamish muttered to himself, thinking of his unfinished coffee and the quiet evening he had planned. A perfectly good Tuesday, utterly ruined. He stood up, adjusted his cap, and looked at the horizon. The headlights of a convoy were already visible in the distance, cutting through the mist like the eyes of a predator. Blair was coming, and with him the end of peace in Lochdubh. The silence of the moor was not merely broken, it was obliterated. The rhythmic, lonely call of a distant curlew was drowned out by the discordant wail of sirens that echoed off the granite faces of the surrounding hills. 3 police cruisers, led by a black sedan that took the corners with a reckless disregard for its suspension, tore up the narrow track toward the standing stones. They skidded to a halt in a spray of peat-stained slush, and before the engines had even ceased their rattling, the door of the lead car flew open. Detective Chief Inspector Blair erupted from the vehicle like a pressurized canister of ill will. His face, always a precarious shade of mottled beetroot, was deepened to a dark violet by the biting Highland wind. He wore a cheap, tan trench coat that was already beginning to soak through, and a suit that looked as though it had been slept in by someone significantly smaller and angrier. Behind him trailed his usual shadows, Detectives Anderson and McLean, who looked significantly more miserable to be out of their warm office than their superior. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of exertion and habitual fury. He stomped through the heather, his city shoes immediately sinking into a hidden bog-hole with a squelch that sounded like a wet slap. "You great lanky streak of Highland nothing! I might have known I'd find you standing about looking useless while a taxpayer lies dead in the mud." Hamish stood perfectly still, his hands deep in the pockets of his waterproof, his expression one of mild bovine confusion. "Good evening to you, sir. I was just keeping the scene secure, as per the regulations." "Regulations? You wouldn't know a regulation if it bit you on your bony backside." Blair reached the standing stone and pulled up short, his eyes bulging at the sight of Crispin Westlake. He stared at the neon orange, meditation suit, and the silver sunset goggles for a long beat of silence. What in the name of all that is holy is this? Is it a murder or a low-budget science fiction convention? "He was interested in wellness, sir," Hamish offered softly, shifting his weight. "Mr. Westlake was planning a retreat. I believe the suit is for alignment." "Alignment? He's aligned with the afterlife now, thanks to your incompetence." Blair turned his gaze toward Archie McLean, who was trying to vibrate himself into invisibility behind a nearby boulder. "And who's this? The village idiot? Or did you just invite the local criminal element up for a picnic around the corpse?" "That's Archie, sir. He found the body," Hamish said. "Found it, did he?" Blair's eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated suspicion. He marched over to Archie, who began to tremble so violently that his cap fell off. "Listen to me, you little poacher. Did you kill him? Did you bash his head in because he caught you stealing his fish? It's an open and shut case. I can smell the guilt on you from here. Or is that just the smell of unwashed peasant? I never touched him, Inspector. I swear on my mother's grave." Archie squeaked. He was just sitting there, glowing like a giant carrot, and he wasn't breathing. Blair ignored the plea and turned back to Hamish, jabbering with a frantic, misplaced energy. "Look at the scene, Macbeth. It's obvious. A struggle over land rights. A simple, brutal Highland killing. We'll have this wrapped up by morning, and I'll be back in Strathbane while you're still trying to figure out which end of a pen to bite. Anderson, get the cuffs on this one. McLean, get the forensics team up here, though God knows what they'll find in this bog." Hamish watched as Blair began to stomp around the body, his heavy feet obliterating the very footprints Hamish had been studying.
"Sir, if I might suggest—"
"There's a flask there, and a certain scent of almonds. Perhaps a bit of caution before we jump to conclusions about Archie." Blair whirled around, his finger trembling as he pointed it at Hamish's nose. "Don't you suggest to me, you ginger-haired simpleton. You've been tucked away in this backwater for so long your brain has turned to porridge. Almonds? That's probably just the smell of his expensive Sassenach soap. This is a crime of passion, of local resentment. It's clear as day. Now, get out of my sight. Take your mangy cur and go back to your station. I don't want you contaminating my investigation with your intuition. Go on, mooch off back to the village." Hamish bowed his head, letting a lock of red hair fall over his eyes to hide the sharp, calculating glint within them. "As you wish, sir. I'll just go and stay out of the way. I wouldn't want to be a bother to the real police." "Too right you wouldn't," Blair shouted at his back. Hamish turned and began the long trek down the hill, Lugs trotting faithfully at his heels. He didn't look back at the flashing blue lights or the shouting man in the tan coat. He knew that Blair would spend the next 6 hours bullying Archie and filling out the wrong forms. This was exactly what Hamish needed. By being dismissed as a useless local, he was now free to do the one thing Blair never could: talk to the people who actually knew why Crispin Westlake had ended up dead on a cold moor in a neon-orange suit. As the lights of Lochdubh grew closer, Hamish's mind was already moving toward the village hotel, where the gossip flowed much more freely than the law. The lights of the Lochdubh Hotel glowed with a deceptive warmth through the slanting sleet, casting long, wavering reflections across the puddles of the village square. It was a squat, sturdy building that had stood against the Atlantic gales for over a century, smelling perpetually of damp wool, peat smoke, and the heavy, frying scent of the day's special. Hamish did not enter through the main doors where the tourists, rare as they were in this weather, might see a policeman in a dripping coat. Instead, he skirted around to the kitchen entrance, Lugs trotting behind him with the purposeful air of a dog who knew exactly where the scrap bowl was kept. Inside, the kitchen was a chaotic sanctuary of steam and clattering pans. Nellie, the cook, a woman whose temper was as legendary as her steak and kidney pie, was currently berating a kitchen porter for the crime of breathing too loudly. She turned her glare toward the door as Hamish slipped in, but the steel in her eyes softened, just a fraction at the sight of him. "You look like something the cat dragged in. And then the dog refused to eat, Hamish Macbeth," Nellie barked, though she was already reaching for a thick ceramic mug. "I suppose you've been up on that moor with those fools from Strathbane. I heard the sirens. I suppose someone finally did the world a favour and put a stop to that Westlake creature's noise." "News travels faster than the wind in this place, Nellie," Hamish murmured, gratefully accepting a mug of tea so hot it felt like it was melting his teeth. He leaned against the heavy wooden prep table, looking every bit the slow-witted Constable Blair thought him to be. "Aye, he's gone. Found him by the stones. He was wearing an orange suit that looked like it belonged on a giant radioactive carrot. Nellie snorted, dropping a heavily buttered scone onto a chipped plate and sliding it toward him. A wellness suit, he called it. He was in here last week, complaining that the air in the dining room wasn't oxygenated enough. The man was a walking disaster of a human being, arrogant, loud, and with a wallet that I suspect was as empty as his head. Hamish paused, his tea mug halfway to his lips. Empty, you say? He had a car that cost more than my house, Nellie, and he was talking about investors. Selling air, Hamish. That's all these types do, Nellie said, lowering her voice as she began to viciously chop a pile of carrots. The girls in the office say he hadn't paid the hotel bill for his executive suite in 3 weeks. He kept promising a big wire transfer from London. And he wasn't just rude to the staff, he was cruel. He sacked 2 of the local lads from the estate for the crime of walking too loudly near his meditation room. One of them was young Jamie, Macrae. Archie's nephew, Hamish noted, the piece of the puzzle clicking into place. No wonder Archie had been so terrified. He had a motive as wide as the loch. But Hamish's mind drifted back to the scent of almonds. Did he have any particular habits, Nellie? Anything he was faddy about? He was obsessed with his health, she spat. Wouldn't touch the local water. Had his own special fortified spring water delivered in glass bottles. And he had a special powder he'd mix into a thermos every afternoon. Some kind of ancient Himalayan essence that smelled like a chemist's shop. He told me it was the secret to eternal life. It seems the secret didn't work particularly well for him. Hamish chewed his scone thoughtfully. A man who refused local water but drank a mystery powder from a thermos, the same thermos he'd seen lying in the heather. Did he have anyone with him today? Any of these investors? A couple arrived this morning, Nellie said, pausing her chopping. A Mr. and Mrs. Graham Smith, very posh, very quiet. They looked at him like he was a bug under a microscope. They're staying in the West Wing, had dinner booked for tonight, though I imagine they'll be having a quiet sandwich in their room now that their host has been turned into a Highland ornament. Hamish finished his tea and stood up, his joints protesting the move. He had the gossip he needed. Westlake was a fraud on the brink of financial ruin. He had alienated the locals by sacking their sons, and he was entertaining wealthy investors who might have realized they were being swindled. The wellness powder was the most intriguing bit. It provided a perfect delivery system for something far less healthy than Himalayan herbs. As he stepped back out into the cold, the sleet had turned to a steady, depressing rain. He saw the lights of the police cars still flashing on the ridge above the village. Blair would be up there, freezing and furious, trying to bully a confession out of a man who didn't have the wits to poison a rat, let alone a sophisticated swindler. Hamish, however, knew his next stop wouldn't be the moor. He needed to see Priscilla Halberton Smythe. If there was anyone who could tell him about the social standing and dirty laundry of the Graham Smiths, it was the woman who had spent her life trying to escape the very circles they moved in. The transition from the grease-slicked heat of the kitchen to the plush carpeted silence of the hotel's main lounge felt like crossing a border between 2 different centuries. Hamish wiped his boots as best he could on a heavy coir mat, though the Highland mud seemed to possess a sentient persistence, clinging to his trousers in stubborn clumps. He felt acutely aware of his own scruffiness as he stepped into the amber light of the residence lounge, where the air was scented with expensive beeswax and the faint citrusy tang of a high-end gin and tonic. By the massive stone fireplace, where a log fire crackled with a rhythmic, comforting snap, sat Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She looked, as she always did to Hamish, like an inhabitant of a more refined world, cool, elegant, and entirely undisturbed by the gale rattling the window panes. Her blonde hair caught the firelight, and for a moment Hamish felt that familiar sharp tug in his chest, a mixture of longing and the weary knowledge that a village policeman with a poached salmon in his history was no match for a castle dweller. "You look particularly bedraggled tonight, Hamish," Priscilla said, her voice like silk over gravel. She didn't look up from her book immediately, but a small, knowing smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I assume the neon orange tragedy on the moor has something to do with it?" "Word moves fast, even for the gentry," Hamish said, lowering himself into a wingback chair that felt far too soft for a man of the law. Lugs, sensing the change in social standing, curled up on the hearthrug and immediately began to steam. "It's Lochdubh, Hamish. A man in a bright orange suit dying among the Druid stones is the most excitement we've had since the post office ran out of stamps," Priscilla replied, finally closing her book. She looked at him with those clear, observant eyes. "DCI Blair is currently in the bar, drinking double whiskies and shouting at anyone who looks too Scottish. He's convinced it was a local grudge. Something about sheep or a fence line." "Aye, Blair has a mind like a steel trap," Hamish murmured. "Only it's usually empty when it snaps shut. He's got Archie McLean in the back of a van, poor soul. Archie couldn't poison a sandwich, let alone coordinate a murder," Priscilla said dismissively. She leaned forward, her expression turning serious. "You're looking for something else, aren't you? Something that doesn't fit the angry peasant narrative." "I smelled almonds, Priscilla, and the man had a thermos of powder he called Himalayan essence. Nellie says he was broke, but he was hosting these Graham Smiths." Priscilla's eyebrows rose. "The Graham Smiths? Julian and Clarissa?" "Hamish, if they are here, they aren't investing in a wellness retreat. Julian Graham Smith is a professional vulture. He specializes in distressed assets. He finds people like Westlake, men who have overextended themselves on vanity projects, and he strips them of everything they have left. He's quite ruthless, in a very polite London sort of way." "So he wasn't there to help Westlake?" "Far from it. I heard a rumour at the club in Edinburgh that Westlake had signed over the deeds to the Macrae estate as collateral for a loan Julian provided. If Westlake died before the retreat opened, the land would revert to the Graham Smiths immediately. It's a classic squeeze." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she recalled a detail. "And Clarissa? She has a very particular hobby. She's a chemist by training. She used to work for one of the big cosmetic firms before she married Julian. She's famous for her organic remedies." Hamish felt the pieces shift. The wellness powder wasn't just a fraud, it was a delivery system, and the scent of almonds, the classic calling card of cyanide, fit perfectly with a woman who knew her way around a laboratory. But there was a nagging doubt. If they wanted the land, why kill him so publicly? Why the orange suit and the standing stones? "Because Crispin Westlake was a man of immense vanity," Priscilla said thoughtfully. "He told everyone he was going to ascend at the standing stones during the sunset. If he died there, in his meditation gear, it looks like a tragic heart attack brought on by overexertion and his own eccentricities. A death by wellness, so to speak. It saves the Graham Smiths from a messy legal battle with his creditors." Hamish nodded, his mind racing. He saw the logic of it, the cold, calculated cruelty of the upper class when money was on the line, but proving it was another matter entirely. Blair would never listen to a theory about chemical compounds and land deeds. He wanted a man with a bloody club and a guilty face. "I need to see that powder," Hamish said, standing up. "Be careful, Hamish," Priscilla warned, her voice softening just a fraction. "The Graham Smiths aren't like the locals. They don't shout when they're angry. They just make people disappear into legal paperwork, or worse." "I'm a very small target, Priscilla," Hamish said with a dry, sceptical smile. "Most folk find it hard to hit something that doesn't seem worth the effort." He whistled for Lugs, who reluctantly left the warmth of the fire. As he walked back toward the lobby, he saw the Graham Smiths descending the grand staircase for their quiet sandwich. They were perfectly composed, dressed in charcoal greys and blacks, looking like mourners who had already forgotten the name of the deceased. Hamish slowed his pace, hunched his shoulders, and adopted his most vacant, helpful expression. It was time to start mooching for the truth. The Graham Smiths moved through the lobby like a pair of predatory sharks in tailored wool. Julian was checking a gold watch, his face a mask of bored impatience, while Clarissa adjusted a silk scarf with hands that were steady as a surgeon's. They didn't glance at Hamish. To them, he was simply part of the hotel's rustic furniture, perhaps somewhere between a coat rack and a stuffed stag's head. Hamish, however, watched the way Clarissa's fingers twitched, a tiny, rhythmic movement, as if she were still measuring out precise drops of a solution in a laboratory. They smelled of nothing, not even the rain, which in Lochdubh was an achievement in itself. Before Hamish could intercept them with a clumsy question about the time, the front doors of the hotel swung open with a bang that made the crystal chandelier shiver. DCI Blair marched in, followed by a pale, shaking Archie McLean, whose wrists were now encased in gleaming steel. Blair looked triumphant, his beetroot face shining with a sweat that even the cold Highland air couldn't dry. "Clear the way!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the wood-panelled walls and causing a pair of elderly tourists to drop their shortbread. "Official police business. I told you, Macbeth, a simple Highland killing. Open and shut. We found the motive, and now we've found the smoking gun. Or rather, the smoking hook." He shoved Archie toward the centre of the lobby, drawing a small crowd of curious residents and staff. Blair held up a small evidence bag with the flourish of a stage magician. Inside was a single rusted fishing lure, a blue phantom, peculiar to the local rivers and notoriously difficult to find in shops. "Found this caught in the heather right beneath the victim's hand," Blair announced, his chest swelling with self-importance. "And who in this village is known for using the blue phantom? Who was seen lurking on the moor this very morning by a dozen witnesses? Our friend Archie here. He caught Westlake on the river. They had a row over poaching, and Archie followed him up the hill to finish the job with a heavy rock. Simple, brutal, provincial. I wasn't even near the stones," Archie stammered, his eyes darting to Hamish in a silent, desperate plea. "I was by the lower pool, Hamish. You saw me yourself." Hamish stepped forward, his head tilted at a lazy angle, looking at the lure with a long, slow blink. He looked like a man trying to remember if he'd left the stove on. "It's a fine lure, sir. A bit rusted, though. Archie, do you use the blue phantom?" I might hay one," Archie whispered, "but that one's no mine." "He has dozens in his shed," Blair shouted. Case closed. "Take him to the van, Anderson. We're done here." "Just a moment, sir," Hamish said, his voice mild and apologetic, as if he were asking for a spare match. "I was just wondering about the suit. The orange meditation one. You see, I noticed when I was up there that the battery pack on the waist was switched to internal cycle. It's a very complicated bit of kit, that. You have to press 3 different buttons in a specific sequence to start the heating elements." Blair turned a dangerous shade of purple. "And what does that have to do with anything, you ginger-haired fool?" "He probably turned it on himself." "Well, sir," Hamish said, scratching behind his ear, "Archie here can barely work the remote for his television. He thinks electricity is a form of dark magic invented by the English to tax his soul. He wouldn't know how to turn on a meditation suit, let alone set it to a specific cycle. And yet, the suit was running when Mr. Westlake died. It was heating up his blood, sir, making whatever was in his system work much faster, almost like an incubator." He paused, his gaze drifting seemingly by accident toward the Graham Smiths, who had stopped near the stairs. Clarissa's hand had gone perfectly still on the banister. "But more importantly," Hamish continued, "that blue phantom lure, it's got a bit of green silk thread caught in the hook. Not the kind of thread you'd find on a poacher's jacket. It's the exact shade of that very expensive tweed Mr. Westlake was wearing when I met him this morning. The lure wasn't dropped by a killer in a struggle. It was pulled out of Westlake's own fly box and planted after he was already dead to make it look like a poacher's accident. Archie's hands are far too shaky for such delicate work, especially in a gale. He'd have hooked himself. Blair snatched the evidence bag back. His teeth gritted. A thread? You're basing a defense on a piece of thread? Probably blew off in the wind. It proves nothing. Maybe so, sir, Hamish said, shrugging. But there's also the matter of the thermos. I noticed a second thermos in the Graham-Smith's car when they arrived, the exact twin to the one on the moor. It seems Mr. Westlake and his investors shared a very particular taste in hardware. It's a small world, isn't it? The silence in the lobby became heavy. Julian Graham-Smith took a step forward, his voice a cold, sharp blade that cut through Blair's noise. Are you suggesting something, Constable? Because I assure you, my lawyers will find your intuition very expensive. We were in our room all afternoon. Oh no, sir, Hamish said, his eyes wide and vacant. I'm just a simple village policeman. I was just thinking out loud. It's a bad habit of mine, like mooching tea. I'm sure it's all just a series of very strange coincidences. Blair let out a frustrated growl, shoving Archie toward Anderson. Keep him in the van for now. I don't care about your threads, Macbeth. But I'll be having a word with you in private about thinking in front of my suspects. Get out! As Blair stomped off toward the bar to nurse his wounded ego, Hamish caught a glimpse of Clarissa Graham-Smith. She wasn't looking at Blair. She was looking at Hamish, and for the first time there was no boredom in her eyes. There was only a cold, calculating assessment, the look of a predator realizing that the sheep in the field might actually be a wolf in a very poorly fitting wool sweater. Hamish smiled back, a slow, lazy Highland smile, and knew the red herring had served its purpose. The real hunt for the motive was now the only thing left to uncover. Hamish watched the Graham-Smiths ascend the stairs, their movements synchronized and chilly, before he turned and slipped through a side door that led to the service corridor. He knew better than to remain in the lobby, where Blair might find another reason to bark at him. The air here was cooler, smelling of starch and the damp, industrial scent of the hotel's heavy-duty washing machines. He was looking for Mrs. Kennedy, the head housekeeper, a woman who had spent 40 years being invisible to the wealthy while cataloguing their every sin with the precision of a tax auditor. He found her in the linen room, a windowless bunker filled with the oppressive heat of a drying press. She was folding white towels with a rhythmic ferocity that suggested she was imagining each one was a guest's neck. "I heard you were back, Hamish Macbeth," she said without looking up. Her voice was like two pieces of flint rubbing together. "I suppose you're here to ask about the state of the Englishman's sheets. They were silk, if you must know. He insisted on them, though he hadn't paid the laundry surcharge in a fortnight." "It's no the sheets I'm interested in, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish said, leaning against a stack of pillowcases. Luggs sat by the door, his ears twitching at the sound of the wind howling against the outer wall. "It's the mood in that suite. Mr. Westlake and his guests. They didn't seem like old friends when they arrived." Mrs. Kennedy stopped folding. She looked at Hamish, her eyes sharp behind thick spectacles. "Friends?" They were like three cats in a sack with a heavy stone tied to the top. Mr. Westlake was a bully, Hamish, a loud, posturing bully. But even bullies can be frightened. Yesterday morning, while I was refreshing the minibar, I heard him shouting at the lady. Not about money, though there was plenty of that talk too. He was laughing at her, a cruel, high-pitched laugh. What was he saying? He called her the great failure. He said her little accident in London was the best thing that ever happened to him, because it meant he owned her talent for a pittance. He told her that at the dinner tonight he was going to toast her, not as a partner, but as his private little alchemist who was going to make him a billionaire while she stayed in the shadows where disgraced chemists belong. Hamish felt a cold prickle of understanding. It wasn't just about the land or the collateral. To a woman like Clarissa Graham Smith, a woman who carried herself with the rigid, brittle pride of the upper middle class, social embarrassment was a fate worse than death. If Westlake had been blackmailing her with a past professional scandal, likely the accident Mrs. Kennedy mentioned, then the motive moved from the ledger to the heart. It was petty, human, and deeply vengeful. And what did she say back? Hamish asked softly. Nothing, Mrs. Kennedy replied, picking up another towel. She didn't say a word. She just walked to the window and looked out at the moor. But I saw her face in the mirror, Hamish. She didn't look like a woman being bullied. She looked like a woman who was deciding exactly which tool to use to prune a dead branch from a tree. Hamish nodded, his mind drifting back to the Himalayan essence powder. Clarissa hadn't just killed Westlake for the money. She had killed him because he had tried to strip her of the only thing she had left, her reputation. She had used her own skills, the very ones he had mocked, to turn his wellness routine into a death sentence. The orange suit, the standing stones, the public ascension. It was all a stage she had built to ensure he died in a way that looked like a pathetic self-inflicted joke. There was a folder too, Mrs. Kennedy added, almost as an afterthought. A blue leather one. He kept it in the room safe, but he took it with him when he went to the moor. He said he needed it for the final signature. I didn't see it when the Strathbane police brought his effects back. Hamish straightened up, a missing folder. If that folder contained the evidence of Clarissa's past disgrace, it was the one thing she couldn't afford to leave behind. She would have taken it from the body, but she couldn't have destroyed it easily. Not in a hotel with smoke detectors in every room and a keen-eyed housekeeper on every floor. Thank you, Mrs. Kennedy, Hamish said, moving toward the door. You've a better eye for the truth than a whole room of inspectors. I've just lived longer, Hamish, she grunted, returning to her work. Most folk think the world is run by big ideas. It's run by small spites. Hamish stepped back into the corridor, his pace quickening. The rain was still drumming a frantic rhythm against the building, but the fog in his mind was beginning to lift. He knew where Clarissa was, and he knew what she was hiding, but he also knew that if he simply walked up and accused her, Julian's lawyers would have him in a jail cell before he could say almonds. He needed more than a motive. He needed a trap. He needed to make the killer believe that the stupid policeman had found the one thing she thought was gone forever. He whistled for lugs, his eyes fixed on the door to the hotel's main boiler room. In a Highland hotel during a storm, the boiler room was the only place a person could go to dispose of a blue leather folder without being seen, and the only place where the heat was high enough to turn a career-ending scandal into harmless ash. He just had to hope he wasn't too late to find the embers. The transition from the sweltering industrial thrum of the boiler room to the hushed, amber-lit luxury of the hotel's main lounge was a journey Hamish made with a purposeful stumble. He had seen what he needed to see in the belly of the furnace, the curling, blackened remains of a blue leather spine and the dancing, ghostly ash of high-grade vellum. He knew the evidence was gone, consumed by the same heat that Clarissa Graham Smith had used to accelerate her victim's demise. But Hamish also knew that a murderer's greatest weakness was not the evidence they left behind, but the uncertainty that remained in their own minds. He burst through the double doors of the residence lounge with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a man who had just seen a ghost and tripped over it. DCI Blair was at the bar, currently regaling a trapped and miserable-looking barman with a loud, rambling account of his brilliant tactical manoeuvre in arresting Archie McLean. The Graham Smiths were seated in their usual wing-back chairs by the fire, their faces as cold and impassive as the standing stones themselves. Inspector Blair!" Hamish cried out, his voice cracking with a high, nervous pitch. He stumbled over the edge of a Persian rug, narrowly avoiding a collision with a trolley of afternoon tea. Blair whirled around, his face turning an immediate violent shade of plum. What in the name of God is it now, Macbeth? I told you to go home. Have you finally lost the few wits you were born with, or are you just trying to ruin my evening out of spite? It's the folder, sir, Hamish gasped, leaning heavily against a mahogany pillar and wiping a fake bead of sweat from his brow. The blue one, the one the housekeeper mentioned. One of the local lads, young Jamie Maclean, he found it. He was out checking his snares up on the moor, near where you found the body, and he saw it tucked into a crevice in the rock. He was too scared to tell you, sir, on account of you having his uncle in the van, so he brought it to the station just now. The silence that followed was absolute. Clarissa Graham-Smith's wineglass stopped perfectly still halfway to her lips. Julian didn't move, but the muscle in his jaw gave a sharp, involuntary jump. "A folder?" Blair barked, his eyes bulging with the sudden greedy prospect of a new piece of evidence to claim as his own. "Where is it? Why didn't you bring it here?" I thought it best to leave it in the station safe, sir," Hamish stammered, looking down at his boots with a sheepish bovine expression. "The lock's a bit sticky, and I didn't want to carry it through the rain. I thought I should tell you first. It's full of chemical formulas and old newspaper clippings about a laboratory explosion in London 10 years ago. I couldn't make head or tail of it, being just a village copper, but it looks very official. It's got confidential stamped all over it." Clarissa's eyes narrowed into slivers of polished ice. Hamish had mentioned the laboratory explosion, a detail he shouldn't have known if the folder had truly been destroyed. He watched her from beneath the brim of his cap, seeing the calculated panic begin to take root behind her elegant facade. She knew she had burned the folder, but she was now wondering if Westlake had made a copy, or if Jamie Maclean had found something else. "A laboratory explosion?" Blair roared, his chest puffing out like a territorial pigeon. "Chemical formulas? This is it. This is the proof of a wider conspiracy. It probably links the poacher to a radical environmentalist group. Macbeth, you're an idiot for leaving it there. Anderson, Maclean, with me. We're going to the station right now." "But, sir, the gale—" Hamish started, his voice a pathetic whine. "Shut up! I'm taking the car. And don't you dare touch that safe until I get there, do you hear me? If you so much as breathe on that evidence, I'll have you directing traffic in the middle of a peat bog for the rest of your miserable career." Blair charged out of the lounge, his subordinates scurrying behind him like terrified ducklings. Hamish watched them go, then turned his gaze back toward the Graham-Smiths. He looked utterly dejected, a man defeated by his own superior's temper. "I'm sorry for the disturbance, sir, madam," he murmured, bowing his head in a clumsy show of respect. "I'll just go and check on my dog. He's in the police van around the back, and the poor beast hates the thunder." He shuffled out of the lounge, but as soon as the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, the stupid policeman vanished. Hamish straightened his back, his eyes clearing with a sharp, predatory intelligence. He didn't go to the van. Instead, he slipped into the darkened coach-room near the rear service exit, which overlooked the path to the station. He knew exactly what Clarissa Graham-Smith would do. She knew Blair was heading to an empty station, but she also knew Hamish had seen something, or thought he had. She couldn't risk him talking to Blair again. She had to know what was in that safe, and more importantly, she had to ensure Hamish Macbeth didn't live long enough to explain why he recognised those chemical formulas. In the Highlands, a clumsy policeman slipping on a wet pier or falling into a swollen burn was a tragedy, but it wasn't an unusual one. Hamish settled into the shadows, his hand resting on the heavy, old-fashioned iron torch in his pocket, waiting for the lady to show her true colours. The shadows in the coat-room were deep and smelled of wet wool and cedar, providing a perfect vantage point for a man who had spent half his life waiting for deer to emerge from the tree line. Hamish didn't have to wait long. The rear service door, a heavy thing of iron-bolted oak, groaned on its hinges. A sliver of grey light from the storm-lashed courtyard spilled across the floor, and a figure stepped out into the rain. It wasn't Julian, the silhouette was too slight, the movements too graceful and deliberate. It was Clarissa Graham Smith, draped in a dark, high-end waterproof that shimmered like oil on water. She didn't head for the main road where Blair's sirens were still a dying echo. She took the narrow, slippery path that skirted the edge of the sea loch, leading toward the police station's rear entrance. Hamish let her gain a 20-yard lead before he slipped out of the hotel. The wind tried to rip the cap from his head, and the rain felt like needles of ice against his neck, but he moved with a fluid, silent speed that would have shocked DCI Blair. He followed her past the dark shapes of the village boats, which bobbed and strained at their moorings like frightened horses. As the path narrowed near a steep, rocky drop into the churning black waters of the loch, Clarissa stopped. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and metallic, a set of lockpicks, or perhaps a heavy key she'd pilfered from the hotel's master board. "It's a treacherous bit of road, Mrs. Graham Smith." Hamish's voice drifted through the gale, calm and conversational, as if they were discussing the price of wool in the village shop. "The stones are loose, and the water is very deep this time of year. A person could fall and never be found until the spring thaws." Clarissa whirled around. The hood of her coat fell back, revealing a face that was no longer elegant. Her features were twisted into a mask of sharp, desperate hatred, her eyes reflecting the dim light of the village lamps like a cat's. She didn't look like a lady of the manor. She looked like a cornered viper. "You," she spat, the word barely audible over the roar of the wind. "The simpleton. I knew you were lying about that folder. I burned it myself. I watched it turn to ash in that filthy boiler." "Aye, you did," Hamish said, stepping closer, his hands held out loosely at his sides. "But a woman of your education should know that ash tells its own story. And a man like Westlake, he was greedy, but he wasn't stupid. He'd have kept a copy somewhere. Maybe not in a blue folder, but in a bank vault in London. Or maybe he just told someone like me." "He told you nothing," she screamed, and suddenly she lunged. She didn't strike out with her fists. She swung a heavy, leather-bound purse with a force that would have cracked a man's skull. Hamish, showing the deceptive agility of a Highland poacher, ducked beneath the blow. He caught her wrist, his grip like iron. "Careful now," Hamish murmured, his face inches from hers. "You've already killed one man today with your wellness powder. Cyanide is a messy business, Clarissa. It leaves a scent of bitter almonds that even the Highland wind can't wash away. You put it in his thermos, didn't you? And then you turned on the heating cycle in his suit to make sure the poison hit his bloodstream before he even realized the tea tasted a bit off." "He was going to ruin me," she hissed, struggling against his grip with a surprising wiry strength. "He was a parasite. He used that accident in London to keep me under his thumb for years. I was the one with the talent, and he was just the loudmouth who sold it. I won't go to jail for a creature like him." She reached into her other pocket, and this time Hamish saw the glint of glass. A small vial, the stopper already removed. She tried to dash it into his face, but Hamish didn't flinch. He twisted her arm behind her back in a swift, practiced motion that sent the vial flying into the heather. Clarissa let out a sharp cry of pain and frustration as she was forced down onto her knees in the mud. "The folder in the safe was a lie, Clarissa," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a low, grim tone. "There is no Jamie MacLean checking snares tonight. There's just me, and the fact that you've just confessed to a murder while trying to assault a police officer. Wasn't the most wellness-oriented move you've made." As if on cue, the lights of a vehicle appeared at the end of the path. It wasn't Blair's car. The DCI was likely still red-faced and screaming at a sticky lock at the station. But the local doctor's Land Rover, which Hamish had signalled earlier with a quick, quiet phone call from the kitchen. Hamish stood over her, his red hair plastered to his forehead, looking down at the broken woman in the mud. The undercurrent of darkness that always hummed beneath the Highland charm was fully on display now. He had caught his killer, but there was no joy in it, only the weary satisfaction of a man who had protected his village from a different kind of predator. "Lugs!" Hamish called out. The dog emerged from the shadows of a nearby boat shed, his tail wagging once as he surveyed the scene. "Watch her, and don't let her eat any of the heather. I suspect she's seasoned it with something quite nasty." Clarissa slumped into the muck, her expensive coat ruined, her reputation finally and irrevocably shattered. Hamish looked up at the standing stones on the ridge, silhouetted against a flash of lightning. The elite wellness of Lochdubh had come to a very messy end, and Hamish Macbeth was already thinking about the pot of stew waiting for him at home, and how on earth he was going to make sure Blair got the credit for this without having to spend a single hour in an office in Strathbane. The doctor's Land Rover sat idling on the gravel, its headlights cutting through the rain to illuminate Clarissa Graham-Smith as she sat, broken and shivering, against a rusted iron mooring post. Dr. Brodie, a man whose medical practice in the Highlands had taught him that the soul often needed more patching than the skin, stood by with a heavy wool blanket, his eyes meeting Hamish's in a look of quiet understanding. He didn't ask questions. In Lochdubh, one simply accepted that the local constable's luck was often a very calculated form of genius. The silence of the lochside was soon violated by the familiar, high-pitched scream of a police siren. DCI Blair's car rounded the corner, tyres screeching as it lurched to a halt. Blair exploded from the driver's seat before the vehicle had fully stopped, his face no longer beetroot but a dark, dangerous shade of bruised plum. "Macbeth!" Blair shrieked, his voice cracking against the wind. The station was locked. There was no one there. No Jamie MacLean, no folder, and the safe was empty. "I'll have your badge for this. I'll have you sweeping the streets of Glasgow with a toothbrush. You've made a mockery of a detective chief inspector." Hamish stood up slowly, his shoulders hunched in a posture of profound, apologetic misery. He looked like a man who had just accidentally stepped on a kitten. "Oh, sir, it's a terrible thing. Truly, I must have misunderstood. The lad. He's a bit flighty, you know. But look at what's happened, sir. It's just as you predicted." Blair stopped mid-stride, his finger still shaking in the air. What are you babbling about?" Hamish gestured vaguely at Clarissa, who was being helped into the back of the Land Rover by Dr. Brodie. "Your brilliant interrogation in the lobby, sir. It was a masterpiece of psychological pressure. You had her so rattled, so terrified of your keen intellect, that she panicked the moment you left for the station. She must have thought you were going to find the real evidence in that folder, the one you mentioned about the London laboratory." Blair blinked, his rage momentarily stalled by the sudden injection of flattery. "Well, I did mention the laboratory, didn't I?" "You did indeed, sir. You said it was a wider conspiracy, and you were right. She ran for it, sir, right out the back door. I was just out here giving Lugs a bit of air, the poor beast was feeling the thunder, when I saw her trying to throw this into the loch." Hamish held up a small evidence bag containing the vial of clear liquid he'd retrieved from the heather. "I remembered what you said about smoking guns, sir, and I managed to catch her before she could dispose of it. She's confessed to everything. She said your presence was suffocating her. Those were her very words, sir." Blair's chest began to expand, his ego inflating like a punctured tyre being fed a fresh line of compressed air. He looked at Clarissa, then at the vial, and then back at Hamish. The suspicion was still there, flickering in the back of his small, mean eyes, but the lure of a high-profile arrest, one that would look magnificent in the Strathbane papers, was far too strong to resist. "Confess, did she?" Blair muttered, straightening his sodden trench coat. "Suffocating, eh? Well, it's a known fact that my methods are intense. I knew the moment I saw her that she was the weak link. The Graham Smiths thought they could outsmart a man of my experience, but I had them in my sights from the beginning. It was a wonder to watch, sir, Hamish said, his voice a soft, admiring lilt. I'd never have suspected a lady like that. But you saw through the polish. You'll be wanting to take her back to Strathbane yourself, I imagine, for the formal recording of the statement. It wouldn't do for a simple constable to handle such a sensitive, high-level confession. Too right it wouldn't, Blair snapped, the transition from fury to arrogance complete. Anderson, get her out of the doctor's car and into the sedan, and get that vial properly tagged. This is a massive win for the department. A death by wellness. The press will love it. I can see the headlines now. Blair's intuition cracks Highland murder case. Hamish stepped back into the shadows, a small, weary smile playing on his lips as he watched Blair begin to shout orders at his weary subordinates. He saw Julian Graham Smith being escorted from the hotel by Detective McLean, looking pale and utterly defeated. The vulture had finally found a carcass he couldn't pick clean. "You're a devious man, Hamish Macbeth," Dr. Brodie murmured as he closed the door of his Land Rover. "You've just handed a promotion to a man who'd sell his own mother for a favourable mention in the Gazette." "Aye," Hamish whispered, watching the tail lights of the police convoy disappear into the rain. "But he'll be doing it in Strathbane, Doctor, and I'll be staying right here in Lochdubh. A promotion is a heavy thing to carry, and I've already got a salmon and a murder to weigh me down tonight." He whistled for lugs, and together they began the walk back to the police station. The storm was finally beginning to break, the clouds parting to reveal a single cold star hanging over the dark waters of the loch. The peace of Lochdubh was returning, bought at the price of a little deception and a great deal of silence. The silence that followed the departure of the Strathbane police was not an empty thing. It was a thick, comfortable blanket that settled back over Lochdubh, mending the holes torn by sirens and shouting men. The rain had slowed to a rhythmic dripping from the eaves of the houses, and the air held that peculiar sharp sweetness that only comes to the Highlands after a heavy purging storm. Hamish walked slowly through the village square, his boots clicking softly on the wet cobblestones. The Lochdubh Hotel was dark now, save for a few dim lights in the hallway. The elite wellness era of the Macrae estate had ended before the first green smoothie could even be poured. Inside the police station, the air was chilly, but it felt like home. Hamish moved with his usual slow, deliberate economy, hanging his sodden waterproof on a peg and kneeling before the small iron stove. Luggs sat nearby, watching with intense interest, as Hamish coaxed the dying embers back to life with a few sticks of kindling and a fresh lump of peat. Soon a cheerful orange glow began to dance across the floorboards, and the kettle began its low, promising hiss on the stovetop. There was a soft, tentative knock at the door. Hamish didn't need to look at the shadow through the frosted glass to know who it was. He opened the door to find Archie McLean standing there, looking remarkably well for a man who had spent the evening in the back of a police van being accused of murder. He was holding a small brown paper parcel, and his face was split by a wide, toothy grin. "They let me go at the edge of the village, Hamish," Archie said, his voice hushed with awe. "The big fella Blair, he didn't even look at me. He was too busy talking into his mobile phone about press releases and career-defining breakthroughs. He nearly stepped on my foot getting into his car." "Aye, he's a man with a lot on his mind, Archie," Hamish said, stepping back to let the poacher in. "The weight of all that brilliance must be a terrible burden. He thinks he caught her, Hamish. He really thinks he did it all himself," Archie chuckled, shaking his head as he handed over the parcel. "Nellie sent this down from the kitchen. Said you looked like you were fading away to nothing. It's a bit of the venison pie from the late sitting, and there's a bottle of the good stuff from the cellar, a gift from the manager for keeping the peace during the unpleasantness." Hamish accepted the gifts with a grateful nod. "Tell Nellie she's a saint, and the manager is a man of rare discernment. Sit down, Archie. The tea's just about ready. They sat in the warm kitchen, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the occasional pop from the stove. Archie made short work of a mug of tea, his hands finally steady. Do you think they'll come back, Hamish, the Graham Smiths? Or another one like that Westlake fellow? Hamish looked out the window toward the dark humps of the mountains. The Highlands have a way of dealing with folk who try to change them too fast, Archie. They come with their money and their big ideas and their wellness, forgetting that the land was here long before them and will be here long after. Mr. Westlake wanted to sell the piece of Lochdubh to the highest bidder. He found out the hard way that the piece here isn't for sale. It's earned by living with the rain and the silence. And the law? Archie asked with a wink. The law is like the mist, Archie, Hamish replied, a dry, sceptical humour glinting in his hazel eyes. It's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. As long as it doesn't get in the way of a good pot of stew, we'll get along just fine. After Archie had departed, promising to stay off the Macrae beat for at least a week, a promise Hamish knew was worth less than a handful of wet peat, the constable sat alone with lugs. He opened the morning edition of the Strathbane Gazette, which had arrived via the late post. There, on the front page, was a grainy photograph of DCI Blair, looking immensely pleased with himself, standing beside a grim-faced Clarissa Graham Smith. The headline screamed, "Local detective cracks Highland murder conspiracy." Hamish smiled. It was perfect. Blair was a hero, which meant he would be far too busy giving interviews and attending award dinners to bother a lowly constable in a remote village. There would be no transfer to the city, no promotion to a desk in a concrete block, and no one to tell him he couldn't spend his mornings observing the water levels of the Black Water. He poured the last of the tea and leaned back in his chair, feeling the warmth of the fire seeping into his bones. The murder was solved, the outsiders were gone, and the village was its quiet, gossipy, slightly lawless self again. Outside, the first hint of dawn was beginning to touch the peaks of the hills, turning the grey mist to a soft, ethereal violet. Hamish Macbeth, the laziest and smartest policeman in Scotland, closed his eyes for a well-earned nap, happy in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. The dawn did not break over Lochdubh so much as it bled through the mist, a pale, watery light that turned the sea loch into the colour of a bruised oyster. Hamish stood at the station window, a chipped mug of coffee cradled in his hands, watching the village stir. The milk float from the dairy in Bonar Bridge rattled over the cobbles, and the first tendrils of blue peat smoke began to curl from the chimneys of the cottages along the waterfront. To any observer, it was merely the start of another slow, inconsequential day in a forgotten corner of the Sutherland coast. To Hamish, it was a victory of the highest order. He turned back to the kitchen table, where the Strathbane Gazette lay open. He lingered on the image of DCI Blair, whose expression was a terrifying cocktail of arrogance and indigestion. The article mentioned tireless surveillance and meticulous forensic analysis, phrases that Hamish knew were code for Blair shouting at a junior officer, until the man found the right paperwork. There was no mention of a lanky constable, a missing blue folder, or a scent of bitter almonds on a cold moor. "We're safe for another season, Lugs," Hamish murmured, tossing a scrap of venison pie crust to the dog. Lugs caught it mid-air with a practiced snap of his jaws. "As far as the chief constable is concerned, I'm still the most incompetent, work-shy officer on the payroll. They wouldn't dream of moving me to a city post now. I'd only lower the average intelligence of the precinct, according to Blair's latest report." A sharp rap on the door broke his reverie. It wasn't the desperate, frantic knock of a crime witness, but the firm, rhythmic tapping of someone who owned the air they breathed. Hamish smoothed down his red hair, adopted his most vacant, slightly confused expression, and opened the door. Priscilla Halberton Smythe stood on the step, looking radiant in a heavy cream-coloured sweater and tailored trousers that probably cost more than Hamish's annual salary. She held a small basket of eggs and a look of deep, knowing amusement. "I see the hero of Strathbane has made the headlines," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She glanced at the newspaper on the table. "I assume you're going to let him keep his crown?" "It's a very heavy crown, Priscilla," Hamish said, pulling out a chair for her. "And my neck isn't built for the weight of it. Besides, I think the inspector deserves a bit of glory. It keeps him busy in the city, and it keeps him away from our quiet little loch." Priscilla sat down, her eyes scanning the small, cluttered room. She noticed the empty bottle of wine from the hotel cellar and the lingering scent of Nellie's venison pie. "The village knows, Hamish. They always know. Mrs. Kennedy told me about your visit to the boiler room, and Archie hasn't stopped talking about the secret folder that never existed. You've become a bit of a local legend again, much to your own annoyance, I suspect." "Legends are for the dead, Priscilla. I'm just a man who likes his breakfast in peace," Hamish replied, pouring her a cup of coffee. "The Graham Smiths are gone, the Wellness Retreat is being liquidated by the bank, and the Macrae estate will likely go back to being a quiet, overgrown mess where the deer can wander without being told to meditate. That's a good enough result for me." "And the killer?" Priscilla asked, her voice softening. Clarissa didn't seem the type to break so easily. "She didn't break because of the law," Hamish said, his gaze drifting to the iron stove. "She broke because she realized that in a place like this, she was invisible. Her money, her status, her chemical genius, none of it meant anything to the mountains or the rain. She was just a woman in a wet coat who had lost her way. People like that always underestimate the Highlands. They think they can master the landscape, but the landscape just waits for them to make a mistake." They sat in silence for a moment, the warmth of the stove a pleasant contrast to the damp morning air outside. It was a comfortable silence, born of long acquaintance and the shared secrets of a dozen such mysteries. Priscilla eventually stood up, smoothing her trousers. "I have to get back to the castle. My father is in a state because the cook refused to make his porridge with the specific oats he likes. But keep the eggs, Hamish. They're from the home farm. And try not to get into any more trouble for at least 48 hours. The village's nerves are a bit frayed." "I'll be the very soul of discretion, Priscilla," Hamish promised, walking her to the door. As her car pulled away, Hamish stood on the step for a long time, breathing in the scent of salt and pine. He saw a flash of silver in the river, a salmon leaping, and felt the familiar itchy urge to go and see if he could liberate it for his supper. The Sassenach threat had been neutralized, the incompetent boss was satisfied, and the love of his life had brought him eggs. He whistled for lugs, grabbed his tattered waterproof, and headed down toward the water. DCI Blair could have the headlines, and the Graham Smiths could have their legal battles in London. Hamish Macbeth was back to his lazy routine, a king in his own small, misty kingdom, where the only thing that truly mattered was the rise and fall of the tide, and the steady, comforting ticking of a village heart that refused to be rushed.